Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tusk 1157 sent me an email asking about the TV show Hunting Hitler and what were my thoughts on it. I'd watched the show back when it was on in 2015. I liked the story, but the production was a bit much. I know they had to make a show run like an action movie, and they wanted people to tune in each week, so they made it a lot more exciting than interesting. As for Adolf committing suicide, well, I haven't believed that in decades. Ever since I started reading, I was drawn to books a lot of folks ignored. The more I read, the more I began to realize a lot of history is what others want us to believe happened. If someone tells a lie long enough, it begins to creep into people's minds and it establishes itself as being the truth. Hitler was born April 1889. He was from Austria, but he joined the German army during the war to end all wars, also known as the Great War. As the war stretched on, the domestic situation in Germany was deteriorating due largely to food shortages caused by the Allied blockade. The failure of the Spring Offensive and the loss of her allies in mid to late 1918 eventually resulted in Germany's surrender and the signing of a ceasefire November 11, 1918. The world decided Germany was going to pay for the destruction caused by a worldwide conflict. This drove Germany into a death spiral. The citizens became convinced the entire world was out to destroy them. The world was convinced there could never be anything like the Great War, so they all got on with building their countries to live in peace. Germany began preparing for war almost as soon as the ink dried on the Versailles Treaty. Adolf Hitler was one of the few soldiers still in the German army after the surrender. He was assigned to the secret police to infiltrate communist organizations and labor parties. One night in 1919, Adolf was sitting in a room full of disgruntled Germans, all listening to speakers at the German Workers' Party. What they were saying struck a chord, and Adolf decided to join. He was given member number 555, which would make you believe there were 554 other members. Actually, the party had started counting at 500. Adolf was the 55th member. You could say he had a gift for gab because he soon became the head of the Workers' Party, and he changed the name to the National Socialists' Workers' Party. As shortly, it became just the National Socialists or the Nazis. The rest of the countries thought there was no way the world would ever be drawn into a war like that last one. As the Nazis rebuilt the German military, the rest of the governments kept their soldiers and their sailors to a bare minimum. No need to build big, huge warships. They would just keep what they had. The Romans had it right back in the beginning. Si vis pacem, parabellum. To live in peace, prepare for war. Germany was preparing for war, but not so much peace. Well, after they started fighting, the war was going well for the Nazis. It was almost as if they couldn't lose. Of course, they were fighting inferior militaries with a far superior fighting force. They plowed through Europe like the other armies weren't even trying. As each nation fell, the Nazi officers would steal anything worth having. Gold and artwork were shipped back to Germany in an industrial scale. Things started to go south. The rest of the world had finally said they were mad as hell and they weren't going to take it anymore. The Nazis began to see the writing on the wall. They began shipping massive amounts of gold and silver out of the country and out of Europe. They were perfectly happy to let the German people take the blame for all the nasty things that Nazis had done. In or around 1943 or 44, the German Luftwaffe began building secret airfields in out-of-the-way locations where Nazi high command could slip away and escape should the need arise. Just an open field where a small plane could land and take off. Sometimes there was a building or two and a fuel storage facility. Argentina was a close ally of the Nazi Party. They had supported them from the day one. During World War II, Argentina clearly favored the Axis because of close cultural ties with Germany, Spain, and Italy. This is not surprising, as most people living in Argentina were of Spanish, Italian, or German descent. Germany began sending piles of gold and silver to Argentina and several other South American countries. They also established close relations with not just the governments, but many of the people living in these countries. Back in 1917, Mexican President Venustiano Carranza, let me try that one some more, Venustiano Carranza ordered his government to study a German offer of military support if Mexico would attack the United States. In Mexican eyes, the United States had illegally seized 1/3 of Mexican territory during the 1847 Mexican-American War, including what are now the states of California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. Well, Mexico did declare war on the United States, but, well, that's another story. In 1916, a U.S. Army Expeditionary Force had entered Mexico without bothering to ask permission in pursuit of the notorious revolutionary Pancho Villa, who had raided American cities and towns. Germany had sent military advisors to Mexico to get their army ready for an offensive against those nasty folks to the north, us. Mexico decided that this idea of attacking the U.S. was not a good idea. I guess they remembered what happened during the last little battle. At the end of the Great War, most of these advisors decided to stay in Mexico. It was far better than returning to Germany, where the economy was heading down the drain fast. During the Second Great War, now known as World War II, Mexico was full of German spies, all walking around with Swiss passports. Several folks I know who were living in Laredo back in the 1940s said they would see these people walking around Laredo, asking questions and looking for any information regarding the Laredo Army Airfield, which was an important training facility for B-17 bomber crews. Nazi Germany nurtured any and all relations with foreign countries that showed an interest in fascist ideology. Argentina was full of Nazi spies, and Argentine officers and diplomats held important positions in the Axis Europe. Perón's government was a big fan of the fascist trappings of Nazi Germany. Many influential Argentinians, including wealthy businessmen and members of the government, were openly supportive of the Axis cause, none more so than Perón himself, who had served as a military attaché to Benito Mussolini's Italian army in the late 1930s. Argentina would eventually declare war on the Axis powers a month before the end of the war. This was simply a ploy to get Argentine agents in place to help Nazis escape after the war. It's not like World War II ended one day in 1945 and suddenly everybody realized how horrible the Nazis had been. Even after Germany was defeated, there were many powerful men in Europe who had favored the Nazi cause and continued to do so. There were still some, even in the United States, that, knowing what had happened during the war, still thought favorably of Hitler. As Spain was ruled by the fascist Francisco Franco. During the Spanish Civil War, Hitler had sent advisors to Spain to help Franco overthrow the elected government. This was not only to help the military, but also a means of training German soldiers and study different and new forms of war. Up until then, the idea was for armies to line up on either side of a field and see who was bigger, badder, and better. The rest of the world pretty much sat on their hands and watched what to them was just a civil war. A few recognized it for what it actually was, the beginning of the next World War. At the beginning of the recognized war, Spain announced they were neutral and would sit this one out. Germany had already stockpiled weapons in Spain to be used by submarine and merchant raiders. All they had to do was sneak into a Spanish port, restock, and then sail away. As the Allies began to push the Nazis out of France, many turned west instead of east. All they needed to do was cross the Pyrenees Mountains and they would be in Spain, along with their stockpiles of treasure. Once there, they began setting up lines of communication and transport to be used in the near future. Switzerland had also remained neutral during the war. Their definition of neutral was somewhat skewed. Switzerland was selling munitions to Germany right up until the end. They also allowed trains full of Jewish prisoners en route to death camps to traverse their country. Gold is more powerful than morals to some. Many important leaders in Switzerland had been outspoken in their support of the Nazis. These men retained their positions after the war and were in positions to help out. Swiss bankers, out of greed or sympathy, helped the former Nazis move, and they laundered their money. Gold is heavy, and if you're on the run, you don't want a couple of gold bars bouncing around in your suitcase. If you do have to hand over a bribe, your gold bars won't go very far. Some folks inside the Catholic Church were also sympathetic to the Nazis, insisting that they were far better than those nasty communists. Some may find this hard to believe. Consider this. Henry Ford was a huge Hitler advocate before the war broke out. If you bought a new Ford car in the 30s, you would get a copy of Mein Kampf, printed in English by the Ford Motor Company. You can look it up online. You will find copies that say Mein Kampf. It's written in English, and at the very bottom it says the Ford Motor Company. My dad found a copy somewhere, and he read it. He didn't like Hitler, but he was an avid reader. When he died, I couldn't find the book anywhere. His copy of Days of Our Years by von Payen is one of the few things I still have. Charles Lindbergh was also a Hitler fan. It wasn't until the end of the war that Lindbergh found out what all had been done in the name of German superiority. In the United States was an organization known as the Bund. The Bund was to consist of only American citizens of German descent. Its main goal was to promote a favorable view of Nazi Germany. In May 1933, Nazi Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess gave German immigrant and German Nazi Party member Heinz Spanknobel, man, that is a name that should have been changed, authority to form the American Nazi Organization. When the United States went to war against Japan and then Germany declared war on the U.S., many of those who admired Hitler didn't automatically decide he was an evil man. There were a lot of Nazi supporters running around the country. Unlike Japanese descendants, it was hard to look at somebody and say, that guy doesn't look like me. Well, unless your ancestors came from Japan. The Allies pushed east from France and west from Russia. Germany was being squeezed in the middle. The propaganda machine was in high drive. A lot of folks living in Germany didn't know the end was rushing up on them. Those who did began to make plans to escape. A lot of people think Hitler was crazy. Some claimed he had syphilis. They say he was a drug addict. Well, he was, but not the things they were talking about. A lot of this was war propaganda being sent out by Washington and London. Would a government lie to its people to win a war? Oh, come on. Nobody could be so dense as to believe governments don't lie. But then I forget. Even today, there are folks who believe everything coming out of Washington. Scary. At the onset of war, the Navy began telling people that Japanese pilots weren't very good. They were all nearsighted. Look at most depictions of Japanese during the war. They all had thick glasses and squinty eyes, as if they were having a hard time seeing. This was done to make people think they couldn't see well. This was a lie to get Navy pilots to believe they had the upper hand in a dogfight. At the beginning of the conflict, the Japanese pilots and their planes were better than ours. They had already been fighting for years against the Chinese, followed by the British. It took our military quite a while to get up to speed. Back to Hitler. The Allies were spreading all kinds of stories trying to discredit him. I'm not saying he wasn't an evil man, but a lot of what was said was not true. He may have been delusional, but I doubt he was crazy. Sitting in his soundproof bunker, he must have looked at a map showing the enemy was closing in. Just because Goebbels was telling the citizens of Germany the war could still be won doesn't mean Hitler would have believed it. For the folks who don't know, Paul Joseph Goebbels was the German Nazi politician who was the chief propagandist for the Nazi Party and Reich Minister of Propaganda from 1933 to 45. He was one of Adolf Hitler's closest and most devoted acolytes, known for his skills in public speaking and his deeply virulent anti-Semitism, which was evident in his public vocal views. As the Allies were closing in, Goebbels, along with his wife Magda, killed their 6 children and then both committed suicide. They didn't have a plan B. Hitler was relatively safe and well protected. Those who didn't have a bunker were up to the old creek, as it were. There were several fanatics who would have done anything for their Fuhrer. Anything. As the Allies closed in on Berlin, Eisenhower told his generals to hold off. Let the Soviets enter the German capital. A lot of people have issues with this decision. Eisenhower said he didn't want to lose any more men, and the war was over. Berlin was going to be a long, drawn-out, door-to-door fight. Around 81,000 Soviet Union soldiers were killed, and another 280,000 were wounded, taking the last German stronghold. The Allies had already decided how Berlin was going to be controlled once Hitler was captured. Stalin wanted Hitler like Ralphie wanted that BB gun. Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression treaty August 23, 1939, and Stalin felt as if Hitler had directly insulted him and he wanted payback. The Soviets entered Berlin, and it was a bloodbath. The unfortunate civilians who got in the way were either beat and tortured or killed outright, men, women, and children. There was a plan in place to keep the Soviets from going beyond Berlin and invading Denmark. As the Soviets were pouring all their resources into Berlin, the American troops were being moved to the north side. This was done to block a Soviet advance to the north. Hermann Goring was number 2 guy in Germany, in more ways than one. He had issues, lots of issues. He was a morphine addict, and he was crazy. Hitler might not have been crazy, but Goring was. Hitler was incensed by the thought of Goring becoming the leader of Germany, so he declared Goring was a traitor, and he put Admiral Karl Donitz in as his successor should the need arise. A lot of folks say this was to happen if Hitler died. And maybe he didn't plan on dying, he just didn't want to be around to take the blame. Donitz was surprised when he learned he had been named Hitler's successor, and he was not alone. When the general of the Waffen-SS, Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner, heard of Donitz's appointment, Steiner responded with, "Who is this Herr Donitz?" Donitz later claimed that Hitler made this choice because he felt that only a reasonable man with an honest reputation as a sailor could make a decent peace. Donitz later told his American captors that he immediately set about surrendering German forces after assuming power. In fact, the admiral prolonged the war as long as he could. Why put the head of the Navy in charge? Maybe so the submarines could be used even after the surrender was declared. Hitler was supposed to have killed himself on April 30th, Walpurgis Night. In German folklore, the night of April 30th, which is May Day's Eve, was when witches would meet on the Brocken Mountain, and they would hold huge parties with the devil. Donitz surrendered all of the German military on May 7th, 1945, but not the Nazis. Now, none of the Nazis gave up. They all ran. Soviet soldiers ran rampant through the city, doing anything they wished. It was not a good idea to be in town. Stalin wanted Hitler. He wanted to show the world he had captured the most evil man on earth. He somehow got the idea that the British had captured the man. The idea became an itch that he couldn't scratch. Look at any photo of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. Roosevelt is almost always in the middle. There was a reason for this. Churchill couldn't stand Stalin. Stalin was sending messages to Churchill saying he knew the British had Hitler and he wanted him. Either turn Hitler over to the Soviets or something bad was going to happen. On June 9th, 1945, at the Potsdam Conference, Marshal Zhukov announced, on orders from Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, that Hitler was either living in Spain or Argentina. In July 1945, British newspapers repeated comments from a Soviet officer that a charred body discovered by the Soviets was nothing but a poor double for Hitler. American newspapers also repeated quotes of the Russian garrison commander of Berlin saying that Hitler had gone into hiding somewhere in Europe. Churchill was tired of hearing from Stalin before the war was even over. He got a hold of his chief of staff and told him to do something to get Stalin to go away. During World War II, Hugh Trevor Roper served as an officer in the Radio Security Service of the Secret Intelligence Service on the interception of messages from German intelligence service. Now, he didn't speak or read German. He was kind of in charge of those who did. In November 1945, Trevor Roper was ordered by Dick White, head of counterintelligence in the British sector of Berlin, to investigate the circumstances of Adolf Hitler's death and to refute the Soviet propaganda that Hitler was alive and living in the West. Mostly, Trevor Roper relied on investigations and interviews by hundreds of British, American, and Canadian intelligence officers. He did question, through an interpreter, one German soldier who had been assigned to guard the entrance to the Führer bunker. This soldier was standing outside the bunker. There were bombs and cannons going off all over the place. The door was soundproof. This soldier is supposed to have said he heard a pistol shot from inside the bunker. Amongst all the bombs and cannons and other noises going on all around him, he hears a pistol shot through a soundproof door. He entered the bunker, and he found both Hitler and Eva Braun dead. They had killed themselves. The Soviets are everywhere. It's time to run. But first, let's drag these bodies outside, dig a ditch, put them in it, burn the bodies, and then we'll run for safety. The two bodies were found that some folks claim were Hitler and Braun. The bodies were beyond recognition. The British military got dental record, a dental assistant. Well, let me try that one again. The military got a dental assistant to redraw Hitler and Braun's dental records from memory. The dentist's office was a smoldering wreck. Now, armed with a hand-drawn sketch of what was supposed to be Hitler and Braun's dental records, the bodies were identified. One small detail, the bridge work found in both mouths didn't fit. Oh, that's just a minor detail. Trevor Roper announced that Hitler was dead at his own hands. Then he wrote a best-selling book and made a ton of cash. The world wanted to believe the most evil man on earth was dead. They gobbled up the news like Jonestown Kool-Aid. I know it was actually Flavor Aid, but that doesn't sound as good. Once Hitler was declared dead, he would have been able to move around since nobody was looking for him anymore. At least, not the general public. Declassified FBI documents contain a number of sightings of Hitler, along with theories of his escape from Germany. The FBI sent men all over the world trying to track down Hitler, even after he was supposedly dead. In the days leading up to April 30th, Hitler had a bunch of his and Eva Braun's personal items sent to Tempelhof Airport. A plane was flown out of the country with nothing in it except suitcases and furniture. This was pointed out in the TV documentary Hunting Hitler, along with a ton of other evidence that the suicide wasn't real. Now, how was Hitler and his new wife going to get from the bunker to the airport? It's only a 40-minute drive, but the streets of Berlin were undrivable. There were folks everywhere trying to shoot anyone. It was total chaos. Once more in the show, they discovered a back door to the bunker. Most people understand a secret underground hiding place is also a trap if you're discovered. Trapped in a hole underground, you'd need a way to escape. All German bunkers were built with more than one way out. Why wouldn't Hitler's bunker be the same? Now, just outside the bunker was an entrance to the Berlin sewer system. This wasn't used for sewage, it was for stormwater. It rains in Berlin, and they needed a way to handle all that water. There were huge underground tunnels that ran all over the city used to handle this runoff. Some of these tunnels were big enough to drive a truck through. This would have been just one way Hitler could have escaped. Hannah Reich was born March 29, 1912. She started out studying medicine but had an interest in aviation. Soon her interest became more of an obsession. In 1934, Reich traveled to Brazil and Argentina as part of a German research expedition to test fly gliders in extreme thermal conditions. In February 1938, Reich became the first person to fly a helicopter, a Fokker Archegillis FA-61, inside a building, the Berlin Deutschland Hall. During the war, Reich became a test pilot for the Luftwaffe. She was considered one of the best pilots in the country, if not the world. April 25, 1945, her boss, Grem, told Reich that she was to fly him to Berlin for a meeting with Hitler. Reich was flying a Fusilier Fi-156C Storch, which was a small, lightweight plane. She managed to set the plane down on a street that led from the Brandenburg Gate, and they both made it to Hitler's bunker, where they stayed for the next several days. Today, there are light poles all along the sides of this street, but back in 1945, the street was wide enough for a plane to land and take off. That's one other thing that they discovered while making that show. The possibility of her having Hitler sitting in the passenger seat cannot be ignored. Once Reich was in custody at the end of the war, she swore she didn't fly Hitler out of Berlin, as she was a good Nazi. Why would she admit to saving his life? There are a few other ways Hitler and Braun might have gotten out of Berlin. The reports of people seeing the pair all over the country in May 1945 are many. A lot more people saw them in May than saw their dead bodies at that bunker. How far would Hitler need to travel to be considered safe? All he would have to have done was get out of Berlin. The Allies were focusing all their attention on the capital. As everybody was heading towards the capital, others were sneaking away. There were thousands of Germans trying to get anywhere other than Berlin. Would the average soldier recognize Hitler if he shaved his mustache off, or he grew a full beard? Anyone in a car would be stopped and questioned, but somebody sitting in a house or a cabin in a small village would be ignored as just some civilian. As soon as all the shooting stopped, it would be deemed safe to move farther west. All Hitler would needed was a document saying he was somebody else. And since his government was responsible for printing all the identification documents, it would have been easy to have a few fake IDs made. Personally, I think Hitler and Eva left on or before April 30th, and the rest of the theories are just smoke. A quick drive through the storm sewers, jump on a plane heading west. There is a story that says that a shadow government in the United States comprised of military-industrial complex and its representatives colluded to help head Nazis as well as Hitler escape in exchange for technical support and scientific research that would help in the coming reckoning with the Soviet Union. This would have been like Operation Paperclip, but on a far grander scale. A lot of nasty things happened even after the shooting had stopped. In Japan, General Ishii, the head of Unit 731, was allowed to retire and live out his days in exchange for secret documents involving experiments conducted on people in China. Unit 731 was where Japanese scientists performed tests on prisoners with plague, cholera, smallpox, botulism, and other diseases. This research led to the development of defoliation bacilli bomb and the flea bomb used to spread the bubonic plague. Some of these bombs were designed with ceramic shells, an idea proposed by Ishii in 1938. At the end of the war, Ishii was given a free ride in exchange for his documents. It is estimated 250,000 people died due to direct orders given by this man. A number of sources say that Hitler managed to escape by plane to Spain, where General Franco took him in. According to Senor Stefan Acetuna, who was one of General Franco's drivers during 1945 and 46, he said he was sent to meet a plane that was arriving at the Madrid airport on April 30th, 1945. He described the plane as being of German origin, and he remembered that it arrived very late, probably after midnight. Following Franco's instructions, the passenger, who had no luggage, was transported directly to the palace. In May 1945, the east wing of General Franco's residence in Madrid was sealed off from the rest of the palace by a surrounding 14-foot-high wall. No explanation of this construction work was ever been forthcoming. The staff assigned to work in this wing were all fluent in German. May 1945, Franco's medical staff ordered from Spain's largest pharmaceutical company a carton of 144 bottles of Dr. Koster's anti-gas pills. This order was repeated on a monthly basis up until October 1947. Theo Morell, Hitler's personal physician, had introduced Hitler to this anti-flatulence medication, and Hitler had become so addicted to the strychnine base of this pill that he was known to take them by the handfuls. Okay, so Hitler had a huge gas problem. Suddenly, in May 1945, General Franco has a need of the identical medication, and the need continued unabated until October 1947. The Clínico San Carlos was about 13 miles from the presidential palace. At the end of 1947, the director of this clinic, Dr. Victor Vega Diaz, received a telephone call from the presidential palace in the early afternoon of Wednesday, November 1st, 1947. He was asked to examine a member of Franco's gardening staff, a man named Addy Lupus. In his personal diary, Dr. Vega wrote he received the call from Generalissimo Franco, which was underlined, and not from one of the staff. Why would the King of Spain call a doctor to come look at a member of the grounds crew? Why would he contact the San Carlos Clinic when the Hospital Francisco Franco, named after him, was only 2 miles away? Adolf Hitler used to call himself Mr. Wolf back when he first met Eva Braun. Does it make your brain hurt to picture Hitler acting cute with his girlfriend? When Dr. Vega arrived, he might have met the patient's wife. She may have introduced him as being Addy Lupus, which is Spanish for wolf. Addy could have been short for Adolf. There's no record of anybody named Addy Lupus anywhere in Spain in 1947. Was it time to move on, or did something happen that caused Hitler to no longer feel safe in Spain? In 1947, Spain had declared themselves to be a kingdom. Having Franco as the king, maybe Hitler wanted his own kingdom. Maybe the plan had been for Hitler to stay in Spain only long enough for the story of his death to become fact in most people's minds. For whatever reason, Hitler was moved to the island of Fuerteventura before being taken to a Spanish submarine, or possibly a German U-boat, for the 5,300-mile trip to Argentina. Not all German U-boats were turned over to the Allies. There were quite a few that were never tracked down. I used to know a guy from the Army who had found one back in the 70s in Venezuela. He was working for the Army doing historical documentation. He came across some records of this one U-boat that had sailed to Argentina, and there was no record of what had happened to it. He went looking, and he found the thing parked in a cave. But that's another story. A lot of Nazi criminals made their way to Argentina. There was a financial incentive for Argentina to accept these men. Wealthy Germans and Argentine businessmen of German descent were willing to pay the way for escaping Nazis. Nazi leaders had plundered untold millions from the Jews they murdered, and as they raided every bank and museum in Europe. Some of the smarter Nazi officers and collaborators saw the writing on the wall as early as 1943, and they began squirreling away gold, money, valuables, paintings, and anything else, often in Switzerland. Ante Pavlik, and his cabal of close advisors were in possession of several chests full of gold, jewelry, and art they had stolen from the Jewish and Serbian victims. This eased their passage to Argentina considerably. They even paid off British officers to let them through Allied lines. Yes, the Allies were the good guys. Just watch any World War II movie and you'll know this. Well, not everybody serving in the military was an upstanding, God-fearing person. There were nasty folks on both sides of the battlefield, just as there were some decent guys on both sides. Try to imagine you're a soldier assigned to guard a particular crossing into a neutral country. Along comes some guy with a suitcase full of money, and he hands you a lot more than you've made in the past several years. You remember all of those poor schmucks that came home from World War I to find no money and no jobs. You're about to be discharged from the army, and you know what you'll find back home. Not much. If you turn the guy in, he'll tell your superiors that you have a bunch of his cash, and you'll have to surrender it. Then your superior might keep the money and let the guy go anyway. If you just pretend this guy is just some poor German trying to get out of the country, you get to keep all that money. You choose. Just remember, we don't always know what we might do until we find ourselves in a situation. By 1945, as the Allies were mopping up the last remnants of the Axis powers, it was clear that the next great conflict would come between the capitalist USA and the communist USSR. Some people, including Perón and some of his advisors, predicted that World War III would start as soon as 1948. In this upcoming inevitable conflict, third parties, such as Argentina, could tip the balance one way or the other. Perón envisioned Argentina taking its place as a crucially important third party in the war, emerging as a superpower and leader of the New World Order. The Nazi war criminals and collaborators may have been butchers, but there is no doubt they were rabidly anti-communist. Perón thought these men could come in useful in the long run. After the war, communist regimes were created in Poland, Yugoslavia, and other parts of Eastern Europe. These new nations requested the extradition of many war criminals that were being held in Allied prisons. A handful of them, such as Ustashi General Vladimir Kren, were eventually sent back, tried, and executed. Many more were allowed to go to Argentina instead because the Allies were reluctant to hand them over to their new communist rivals, where the outcome of their war trials would inevitably result in execution. Or there might be some secret held by these prisoners that the communists could use to get a leg up on the West. A lot of people decided the war was over, so it was time to get on with peace and forget what happened in Europe. We won, let's celebrate, and then we'll start watching those nasty Soviets. The OSS was shipping war criminals into the United States so we could use their secrets to advance our rocket program. Those with nothing important to add to our scientists might have simply passed through the military lines and found passage to South America. Argentina was not the only place in South America that accepted Nazis and collaborators, as many eventually found their way to Brazil, Chile, and Paraguay, as well as other small countries. Many Nazis scattered after Perón's government fell in 1955, fearing that the new administration was hostile to Perón and all of his policies, and they might start sending these folks back to Europe. Most of the Nazis who went to Argentina lived out their lives quietly, fearing repercussions if they were too vocal or visible. This was particularly true after 1960 when Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the program of Jewish genocide, was snatched off a street in Buenos Aires by a team of Mossad agents and whisked off to Israel, where he was tried and then executed. Other wanted war criminals were too cautious to be found. Joseph Mengele spent a brief period in Bariloche before going to Brazil to carry out experiments where he created sets of Aryan twins. Joseph Mengele died in Brazil in 1979 after having been the object of a massive manhunt for decades. The Nazis liked to stick together. They would take over entire neighborhoods or form their own colonies. By far the most notorious of such Nazi colonies can still be found in Chilean Andes. It's called Colonia Dignidad, and it was founded by a Nazi official turned cult leader, Paul Schaefer, who was a religious leader and the head of an orphanage. Schaefer was a low-ranking Nazi but was forced to flee Germany after being charged with sexual abuse of children. 1961, he fled to Chile, convincing hundreds of others to go with him. Little is known of their activity in those early years, but the colony grew steadily. They set up everything a community would need, even a hospital, from which they offered free care for the locals. This was just a way to lure new members to the colony. New members were forced to work, and they were never allowed to leave. Schaefer was in effect king of this secret place, cut off from the outside world. Without needing to pay his workers, Schaefer instead invested in security. He made use of fences, outposts, and even motion sensors. These made the prospect of escape virtually impossible, but also kept outsiders far away. As the years turned to decades, rumors spread that high-ranking Nazis were being shielded in the colony. It was claimed by the CIA that Dr. Mengele was among them. They were free to torture as much as they wished, and no matter what, they were protected by the government. Secretive cults of sex criminals operated their own colony in Chile, which became a haven for Nazis on the run and also a government torture camp. Anyone the government thought might be a threat to their nasty behavior would be sent to Colonia Dignidad to never be seen again. Over time, the presence of so many World War II criminals became something of an embarrassment for Argentina. By the 1990s, most of these aging men were living openly under their own names. A handful of them were eventually tracked down and sent back to Europe for trial, such as Joseph Schwamberger and Franz Stengel. Others, such as Dinko Sakic and Eric Prebke, gave ill-advised interviews which brought them to the attention of the public. Both were extradited, tried, and convicted. As for the rest of Argentine Nazis, most assimilated into Argentine's sizable German community, and they were smart enough to never talk about their pasts. Some of these men were even quite successful financially, such as Herbert Kuhlmann, a former commander of Hitler Youth who became a prominent businessman. Bariloche looks and feels like an alpine village. This is due to the architecture as well as the climate and the mountain region. This is also due to European heritage of the area, which saw many German immigrants settle there in the late 1800s. Bariloche grew around a shop owned by German settler Carlos Wiederhold, called La Allemand, or the German. A lot of folks from Austria, Slovenia, and Germany chose Bariloche to settle in. In the TV documentary Hunting Hitler, a team investigated a compound found in the mountains near Bariloche. The building looked more like something found in downtown Berlin than in the mountains of Argentina. There were hand-painted floor tiles. The woodwork around the doors and windows was very Germanic-looking. Archaeologists examining these 3 stone buildings in the jungle of Argentina's northern Misiones province came to the conclusion that these buildings might have been used to house some very important German escapees. Important such as maybe Hitler and Braun? Perhaps the most famous and brazen Nazi that resided in Bariloche was Erich Prebke, an SS commander who escaped to Argentina on papers issued by the Vatican. He lived freely in Bariloche for 50 years, rising to become the director of the town's German school, Colegio Alemán. Prebke led a blissful life in Patagonia until he was tracked down by ABC News reporter Sam Donaldson in 1994. Donaldson confronted Prebke on the street. Soon thereafter, he was put under house arrest by the Argentine authorities until he was extradited to Italy. Reinhard Kopp was another Nazi living in Bariloche who was also uncovered by Donaldson. He was the one who had ratted out Prebke during their news conference. He disappeared after Prebke was arrested, but then he returned and he died in Bariloche in 2001. Martin Luguig Bormann was the German Nazi Party official and head of the Nazi Party chancellery. He gained immense power by using his position as Adolf Hitler's private secretary to control the flow of information and access to Hitler. If you wanted to talk to the Führer, you had to talk to and maybe bribe Bormann first. He used his position to create an extensive bureaucracy and involve himself as much as possible in all decision-making. Martin Bormann was able to escape the final days of the Nazi Party in Berlin. One of Bormann's jobs was to see to it that nobody was able to sneak up and kill Hitler. With so many people running around, this could be a difficult task. One quick and easy solution was to use doubles. Bormann tracked down a man that looked a lot like Hitler and would have him run around being seen by people who then would be convinced that Hitler was in one place when he was really somewhere else. An assassin would go looking in the wrong place. Once word reached Bormann that Hitler was safe in Spain, he had the Hitler double, along with a female that was supposed to have been Braun, shot, and their bodies were dumped where the Red Army would find them. The officers who found the bodies said they looked like really bad doubles. Bormann was supposed to have left the Führer bunker along with Dr. Stumpfegger and tons of Nazi loot. A witness said he saw them both laying dead near the Leiter train station in Berlin. Both men were buried near the station in a mass grave. When searchers went to recover the bodies, they couldn't be found. Years later, a construction crew working near the station in 1972 uncovered 2 bodies. One was identified as being Bormann. The trouble was, the bones had reddish clay stuck to them. The dirt in Berlin is not red clay. A lot of folks wanted to say that Bormann died near the tracks and his body hadn't been found for 27 years. Bormann was seen in Bariloche on numerous occasions. He was there to make preparations for Hitler to arrive from Spain without the wrong people knowing about it. He was supposed to have died in 1968. He was buried, dug back up, shipped to Germany, and reburied. The body they found was indeed Bormann, only he hadn't died when and where they said he did. The Bormann story is based on files from an Argentinian police officer who sold his files to Hungarian historian Ladislau Faragoa in 1970. In 1998, DNA tests showed that the bones recovered in Berlin were Bormann's, but there was no way of saying exactly when or where he had died. The Allies were unable to verify Hitler's reported death because when the announcement came, the Battle of Berlin was still raging. The Soviets were still destroying anything and everything and killing like there was no tomorrow and no day of reckoning. The following day, the Soviet army, accompanied by a journalist, seized the bunker, and they discovered the body that at first looked to be the Fuhrer. He had black hair and a little black mustache. On first glance, it did resemble the Nazi leader, but it was soon established that it wasn't. The doctors said it was in fact, a very bad double of Hitler, and not the man himself. Body doubles were widely used in the Second World War. Stalin was said to have several, and even Winston Churchill had at least one. Historians are certain that Hitler used them too. Given that this was a fake, it leaves no official record of anybody finding the real body of Hitler in 1945. Bormann was determined to make sure Hitler survived the war and was very committed to Adolf and the Nazi Party. He knew if he wanted to keep his friend alive, he must make sure that nobody was going to come looking for him by making everybody believe that Hitler was dead. Only Bormann and Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller knew about the switch. Even the body doubles would have had no idea of the plan and likely would have assumed they were simply filling in for Hitler while he was off on a secret engagement. The staff who would have been inside the bunker would have seen who they thought was Hitler in his uniform and Eva Braun, and they would have believed it was them. Nobody would have been able to get close enough to tell the difference, and you didn't question Bormann. When word reached Bormann that Hitler and his wife had escaped successfully to Spain, the murders could take place. He would go into the doubles' rooms, shoot them both before removing the bodies. The Nazis built a secret colony in the South Pole. There were underground hospitals, barracks, buildings to be used as houses, massive storerooms filled with all the provisions needed to run a huge underground facility, and factories. The colony was there to be used by submarines and merchant raiders to resupply and as a secret destination should things go bad in Europe. This idea sounded a bit fantastic until a large complex of tunnels with city replicas were discovered underground in Austria after the war. This might lead people to believe that the Nazis had built these tunnels as a blueprint of the facility to be built in the Antarctic. In 1938, the Nazis did send a team to the South Pole for scientific purposes. The man in charge of the mission wasn't a scientist. He was Hermann Goring, the head of the German Air Force. In 1943, Admiral Donitz, the commander of the German U-boat fleet, was heard openly talking about an impregnable fortress in another part of the world that he said he had built for Hitler. When Donitz surrendered to the Allies, radio messages were sent out to all German ships and U-boats to turn themselves in at the nearest port. 2 U-boats showed up in Argentina in June, 2 months after the radio messages would have been received. Operation High Jump was an invasion of Antarctic, under the guise of a mission to establish a U.S. colony on the ice, consisting of 3 naval battle groups, which departed Norfolk, Virginia on 2nd December 1946. They were led by Admiral Richard Byrd. The operation was to last for 2 years, but the Navy left after only a few months. Stories began to spread that they had been attacked by Nazi flying discs coming from under the ice. Had both U-boats left Germany in April, they could have sailed to Argentina, dropped off Hitler and a few of his entourage, then sailed to Antarctica, dropped off supplies before returning to surrender in Argentina. Hitler might have been thinking that living under the ice, when he could live in a residence in a lavish hotel, was a non-starter. A guy named Giordano told the Hunting Hitler team that he was one of 4 men who were hired to meet 2 U-boats off the coast of Argentina. One of the passengers he picked up looked a lot like Adolf Hitler, who was accompanied by 2 women, a doctor, and several other men. Giordano rowed a small boat out to pick up the passengers and rowed them to shore. This meeting had been arranged by several Argentinian high-ranking officials. Each of the men doing the rowing were paid $15,000 for their efforts and to keep their mouths shut. That would be like $180,000 today. In those days, the FBI was responsible for South America. Declassified documents show the FBI was looking for Hitler in Argentina long after the story of his suicide had become accepted fact. The Eden Hotel in La Falda, Cordoba in Argentina was owned by Ida and Walter Eichhorn, who were close friends of Hitler. Hitler sent them a Mercedes-Benz as a gift. It was the first Benz in Argentina. Some of the former staff that worked at the hotel said that they saw Hitler staying at the hotel as late as 1948. If you find this show confusing, don't feel like the Lone Ranger. The entire story of Hitler committing suicide is one enormous mess. Personally, I don't believe he killed himself. Hitler escaped justice somehow and was helped out of Europe by Nazi Party members, as well as folks who wanted money more than they wanted justice. The report of Hitler shooting himself was just a story made up to get Stalin to stop bothering Churchill. Once the story got out, those in charge just let it evolve, kind of like that weather balloon in Roswell. A lot of folks say they actually believe Hitler died by his own hand in 1945. They want to believe the most evil man in history couldn't possibly escape the Allies. Ignorance is bliss. They will also say, what does it matter? It was a long time ago. I hope tonight's show held you on the edge of your seat. Unless you're driving, then it should just help keep you awake. Let me know if you have something of interest you'd like to hear on the show or something you'd like to see in my next book. You can contact me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murdered 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?